Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Reynaldo Morales is assistant professor in the Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing Communication, and a faculty fellow at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Mora Matassi, a doctoral student at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Reynaldo in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies Program, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. In close proximity to Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mora will tell us more about Reynaldo's research and career in just a minute. Then Reynaldo will deliver his seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Mora will moderate. You can enter these questions at any point in time during the talk. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mora, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you for having me as moderator for today's edition of the virtual seminar series. It is an absolute honor to introduce our guest speaker for today. Reynaldo A Morales is assistant professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications, fellow faculty at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, an affiliate of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and of the Center for Latinx Digital Media at Northwestern. Professor Morales completed undergraduate media studies at the University of Lima, Peru in the 80s while working in TV press. He holds an undergraduate degree in Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies, a Master of Science with the School of Education, and a joint PhD with the School of Education and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Morales is an environmental and science education leader who advances knowledge integration processes and culturally relevant education for local communities of practice worldwide. He is a policy analyst and media journalist specialized in sustainable development and indigenous peoples' governance systems, territorial and environmental rights, international law and policy, land tenure, and management of genetic resources. His research inquires about shifts in science education and related to the restoration of indigenous knowledge systems and biodiversity governance, with an emphasis on the use of technology and digital media as methods of inquiry. He has conducted international research in South and North America, South Asia, and Southeast Africa since 2017, being distinguished with prestigious fellowships and academic awards. Prior to his doctoral research, Professor Morales worked since 2011 during his Master of Science degree on research on environmental education with tribal communities in Wisconsin, United States. This upcoming spring, Professor Morales will teach 2 undergraduate and graduate courses at Northwestern and will produce a documentary series in the fall. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Reynaldo A Morales.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Mora and Pablo. It's a pleasure to present today Puyo Center with your academic community and guests. So I'll do my best to share a very powerful story related to the rise of indigenous people. So with your permission, I will share my screen. And I have an interesting PowerPoint presentation that I want to share with you this morning. The presentation is called The Roles of Journalism and Media and Indigenous Peoples' Contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it talks about a transnational scope rather than comparative in order to inform about issues that are specific to indigenous peoples. It's a very cultural, political, and social population with a very distinctive set of rights. So the first and important issue that I want to point out are the contexts of the presentation and the population that I will discuss, the world population. And some of the contexts are about the emergence of transnational indigeneity, the fact that indigenous peoples are not visible in mainstream media or in politics and economic development, that indigenous education has emerged in the last decade as a path of self-determination for indigenous peoples all across the world, and have seen traces of that emergence. That there are fast evolving policies around indigenous peoples at the UN system and supranational governance systems. But in parallel, the emergence of Global South networks. And these networks are specific to places with the reemergence of indigenous peoples that suffered colonization and how they transformed after the formation of the nation states where they live. That there are disparities, nonetheless, in their political recognition. We have these divisions between the North and Global South, and the recognition of indigenous peoples is one of the political marks of the difference between on the global and North, the global poles, South and North. In addition, there is a power differential between science bodies and indigenous knowledge systems. Many people call them traditional ecological knowledge, but their knowledge systems transcends the ecological realms. The fact that there are a myriad of social and environmental issues, the opposition and the confusion about indigenous peoples as right holders versus stakeholders. So when we talk about indigenous peoples, it's very, very different than when we talk, especially in international, supranational, international law arenas. It's very different when we talk about indigenous peoples as right holders or when we talk about stakeholders. Even nation states and even corporations and institutions remain as stakeholders in international law, but indigenous peoples are right holders. And this is an important confusion that right now is being challenged. Also, one important context are the indigenous knowledge solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss, and the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals and Nexus research. And this is what I mean about the emergence of the Nexus research that connects the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and these specific languages, Nexus research, refers to the interrelations between these 17 Sustainable Development Goals in terms of causes and impacts and effects, but also in the way in which our research frameworks should attend to these interrelations. In order to pretty much define or understand who the indigenous peoples is, we must introduce some specific data. Formally, indigenous peoples are around $470 million. 470 million people are living in 70 countries. When we talk about this estimate number of 470 million people, it's a formal recognition by United Nations. In many cases, indigenous peoples have to be recognized because they speak their language, they use their traditional costumes, they even wear their traditional attire and regalia. that they live in isolated places, that they don't speak the dominant languages. Some of these cultural marks count in the way in which indigenous peoples are identified. So what we know is that many more than that, these 470 million people, and informally there are hundreds of millions of people living in urban areas, like Pablo mentioned. Only in Chicago, for example, are more than 100,000 indigenous peoples who have different relationships with their tribal communities, tribal governments. Some of the important contemporary issues that indigenous peoples face today are issues of previous consultation. We'll talk about this framework, the issues of meaningful representation. They are not present, as I said, in media and politics. There are very rare occasions in which indigenous peoples are represented in Congress or local governments. That there are lots of issues in health and education. There is a lack of constitutional recognition, in much less when there are declarations or in treaty amendments and technical recommendations from UN bodies. Many local and national constitutions have many pending implementations, and there is a very limited recognition of many of the technical votes and mandates that UN agencies do. So it's a very an important struggle that indigenous peoples face in their own jurisdictions. The issues of exclusion and shifting citizenship, territorial rights, globalization and assimilation that really played a huge role in how indigenous people resisted to be part of economies and cultures that do not represent them, and the consequence of their economic marginalization. Also, it is important to include the most recent report from IDBEST, the 2029 Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report, that basically confirms that indigenous peoples traditionally own, manage, and use at least a quarter of the global land area, including protected areas and a large number of biodiversity hotspots. And even that they are only 5%, formally 5% of the global population. And the increasing pressure over the lands that they occupy is nonetheless one of the important indicators of the health of the whole planet. And you have here in the screen some key concepts related to indigeneity, related to the notion of indigeneity and how it's being used in academic discourses and in policy as well. The definition of indigenous knowledge systems and how they are being referred in formal academic and policy discourse. What we talk about when we say FPIC, which is an acronym for free, prior, and informed consent, that is part of the Convention of Biological Diversity, the climate change, and other important policy arenas. And the definition of indigenous governance, and this is important that we pay pretty much attention to this definition. That is, for example, establishes that there are practices that take place independent of or prior to colonization by an external political entity. That is an important part of the political lives of indigenous peoples, and it's developed and exercised in opposition to colonial power, adapted to the needs of indigenous peoples and to the colonial settings itself. The international legal definition that you have in screen is also being used formally in many of the treaties and mandates at the UN level. And it has been accepted as the formal definition of indigenous peoples by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other associated documents. Regarding the free, prior, informed consent, the International Labour Organization, Article 169, established the right to prior consultation for indigenous peoples. There are many challenges at the national level to execute this law, specifically because it's linked to the rights of indigenous communities to regulate the legitimacy of extractive and exploitation concessions. And as I said, there's lots of tensions with states. especially in terms of policy, these two terms, free and prior, were challenged by many different nation states. This is something that I see since I joined international indigenous delegations in 2016. And many of the national delegations from many countries try to erase or remove the terms free and prior to associate with informed consent. But indigenous peoples, in a complete unanimous decision, have decided to include free and prior in order to refer to the sequence and to make clear that there must be some processes in these consent processes in order to establish that there is no coercion, no pressure, no intimidation or manipulation, and that all the different studies have been done in advance to any authorization of access to traditional knowledge and territories. Regarding these, what we see here in the screen is also in how FPIC project focus approach would look like, and especially in the issues of knowledge co-production. I did my dissertation research specifically on the different issues related to knowledge integration. And this is how FPIC project focus would look like, in which indigenous peoples and scientists would engage together in knowledge co-production in the consideration of holistic decision-making processes and elements that are also in the screen, that are many cases, elements that traditional science research do not take in consideration. In this arena, in this context, is how global indigeneity emerges in parallel to the conceptualization of capital, technological, and environmental transformation across the world, and in the recognition of the struggles and tensions between indigenous peoples and nation states across the world. Of course, indigenous peoples are coming to UN and forming a very solid and powerful political representation in many different issues that affect them directly, especially the coupling the human rights and environmental rights was a very productive new frontier in order to ensure that participation of indigenous peoples. It's especially important when cutting-edge conventions or mandates on different critical issues are enacted or discussed for that will later become part of national legislations. So in terms of their national, the knowledge systems that indigenous peoples have, that has been known by different acronyms. In this case, I only agreed on calling them under two very accepted terms as indigenous knowledge systems or indigenous traditional knowledge. Many of the literature from the 90s still talk about traditional ecological knowledge, but we know now that the knowledge systems transcend completely the ecological realms, as I said before. And these knowledge systems contrast with international knowledge systems generated by Western universities, research institutions, and private firms. And it has been done under completely different epistemological and material relations that are completely exogenous to science. These knowledge are also unique to a given cultural society. There are very diverse knowledge systems. They are being used for decision-making processes in lots of different land management and economic decision processes. And it has now an immense value also for scientists and planners for solutions to many different critical matters on terms of environmental and ecosystems restoration, for example. So what we have now is that the advancement of a new form of education and a platform between policies, practices, and knowledge systems that are advancing a new form of sustainability education restoration and conservation that is very linked to the way in which indigenous peoples have lived and very, very close to their cultural processes and political processes as well. And so now we see that all around the world. So what I'm trying to share with you there are the common aspects of how indigenous peoples all across the world are moving towards too. And one of the important changes is that there are many more cooperatives, for example, and many more educational processes, ensuring that economic development, knowledge integration, cultural dynamics are all aligned to distinctive needs of these tribal communities. There is also the recognition of that these knowledge systems are very diverse. They are not just one. They don't conform a monolithic body. So what we have now, in what we are seeing in the process of social movement, is a process of educational decolonization, and how participatory processes among indigenous communities are pushing for boundaries or disciplines and processes with organizations that were designed by different principles of capital accumulation and private property, where communal property is affirmed in many of the processes that indigenous peoples have. There is an inherent interdisciplinarity, and there's a recognition that many of the topics that science, traditional Western science, have divided into silos that are all interrelated in indigenous knowledge systems. There are also reaffirmation of associated lands and economic rights that transpires into education and to the vision of a new forms of society, and that indigenous governance in these terms is becoming a new global interconnected reality that is still Western institutions and Western societies need to catch up with. So with all these contexts, it is my interest as in my research and practice was about how media and journalism connects to indigeneity, because lots of the action is happening at local level within those communities, and also at supranational level, and in many delegations participating on the development of international law and policy, but also in intermediate level, how institutions and populations are moving, and how the social dynamics, social, cultural, and economic dynamics are being reflected through processes of meaningful representation. So how meaningful representation is being implemented or present in the way in which indigeneity is emerging across the world. So I want just to share my own experiences through my research, but that intended to be national and international. What I encountered first, right by the end of 2000, it was that a very small number of native radio stations in formal broadcast stations across the world, few of them, and that they were competing in very unfavorable conditions with commercial radio stations and programs that represented Western societies. And they needed to pay especially high costs to local broadcasters, because they are the ones who own radio and TV stations. It was impossible for any tribal community to access a television station and be part of the main television mainstream, for example. Nonetheless, there is a native media confined to the internet right now, because that was a natural way in which native media had to grow nonetheless, despite their lack of presence in mainstream media. And as a result, we have seen through the decades lots of organizations, native media organizations, that have been created, especially in the global north, that are either part of the internal educational and communication process of tribal and indigenous communities, in many cases funded by state programs, state funding, national funding, funding from many national agencies, for example, but none of them were able to reach mainstream. And especially an important feature of many Native media organizations, not only in US, I mean, I will say through the global North and part of the global South, is sharing these values about the emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical dimensions, profiles that Indigenous peoples share across the world, and how they must to inspire their media programs and their content. That's why I continue researching about how Native media can reach mainstream education or mainstream television and mainstream media in any way. And I learned that there is a couple of very important initiatives today. One is the First Nation Experience. This is a group that has been purchasing lots of programs that were done through public funding for national broadcast television. So FNX started buying a lot of programs maybe a decade ago, and started building a programming, and now they have a channel. And FNX becomes the first and only national broadcast television network in the United States, devoted to Native American and World Indigenous context, but it's still nonprofit, and it has many challenges for funding. And many of the programs that they produce are inserted into national broadcast television, but the problem that I've seen is that many of them come in non-prime hours. So if you see some of the important productions for Native American communities happen to be included in the midnight programming, sometimes in the middle of the night. And if a locality wants to watch a program regarding their own tribal community, they have to wait until the program comes maybe a month after, and is sharing their locality in the middle of the night. So we have this problem of a huge dysfunction in which Native media is taking place across US and the global North. There is another very important organization that is Vision Media Maker, that it was the former Native American Public Telecommunications, and that continued putting Native media and creating a Native audience in the United States. But as I said, many of these reaches homes and reaches localities and reaches Indigenous geographies, not only in urban areas, but not only rural areas, but urban areas as well, but confined to the programming of public television. And this is a problem because we see that it happens in different non-prime times. There is also a competition between Native and ethnic media, and I research about how possibly Native American media or Native media in the global North can join ethnic media, and especially the ways in which ethnic media is growing in mainstream television. It's massive right now. Ethnic media is huge in the United States, and it has a lot of preference between the members of different ethnic communities that prefer pretty much their own content than the commercial Western media. But still, Native American media was not too much or too close to the process in which ethnic media conquered spaces in mainstream television. So we see these parallel lanes in which Native and ethnic media are taking place, and I think there is a huge opportunity in which a new consideration of strategic communication leads the way in which these efforts to merge indigenous experiences or minority experiences in the Western world, in dominant societies, have to merge into a meaningful representation of these minorities through lines of empowerment, education, participation, and entertainment. However, I have to disagree with McLuhan that the media is the message. I don't think that it's just the media, indigenous media have to just emerge just to mimic the Western television. It has to bring their own processes, and media itself, just for the sake of producing, I don't think it's the solution. In my case, media takes place in many multiple dimensions. In the process that I especially research is about how local community media education is taking place to fill these gaps. Still, when we don't have ready a process or a dynamic towards mainstream media, I research about media education. The first is a documentary that I've produced in 2009 with UW-Madison about the cultural landscape and the story of the native nations that lived in the area where this university was built. And this is a university that has the most archaeological sites in the world. UW-Madison is the #1 university with archaeological sites. The documentary rescued the memory of the Ho-Chunk Nation, how they were pretty much living in the ground where the university occupies right now. That those grounds were the site of one of the largest ceremonial sites in the Midwest, called the Job, the intersection of 4 lakes. And it was the opportunity for the first time in which indigenous faculties were interviewed, and we developed the first program. And that was the opportunity where I met Professor Patty Lowe, who was just the former director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, among other important indigenous faculty and researchers in the university. And it changed completely the tone in which the university later on created a full work group and task force with the University of Wisconsin system to address issues of and the opportunities in dialogues with First Nations. That started with this documentary in 2009. And so since 2009, many things happened thanks to this documentary. The other work that I've done in terms of community media processes are working with the Department of Biochemistry for 6 years, working in an educational digital media program and project for tribal teachers and students, in using video as a method of inquiry, as a reflective tool for teachers under a specific pedagogical strategic approach with cultural relevant pedagogy. And in my case, I developed a model of participatory educational media for sustainability using the activity systems model. And this was my starting set of relations, my triangle of activity systems, and I put it in practice through creating a participatory educational media and curriculum design for tribal teachers in professional development processes. And so in this case, digital media artifacts, without the aspiration of being part of the mainstream media, promoted alternative spaces for reflection and discussions outside and inside classrooms. So media really played a huge role, different from what media was intended. And in this case, for example, I created resources for teachers in classrooms for science education, with creating different modules. The other one is an important, is the first documentary was done in this case, highlighting the traditional agricultural practices of the Oneida Nation. Many of these documentaries still are used today in many classrooms across the nation, and internationally as well. And I continue with the traditional agricultural practices of the Menominee Nation. These now have thousands of views and are being used by different platforms today. In what we advance is our educational media artifacts that have a different different uses. The project or the process, well, what happened? The process continued with teaching students to, in their process of self-representation, to develop and produce documentaries that talk about their different social struggles, economic struggles, emotional struggles, the different areas of engagement that they could work on with their local needs in thinking about their tribal communities. And we advanced the first tribal youth television program in Wisconsin with new youth indigenous anchors. For the first time, these kids who were troublemakers became anchors of a youth television program, a magazine about environmental issues. That was the first initiative, and from there we advanced into the first.
And welcome to SLC News, the first Native youth television program in the state of Wisconsin.
Right, and this is a magazine, but also a news program. And with my students, we went to Belize, and we traveled through U.S. to many different Native communities. And this is it started as a cohort process where students in the last years of their high school education became already leaders, and now most of my students are now important leaders in the Midwest and across the country. This is another initiative to empower teachers to use digital media to connect with their students in different processes, because there was a gap in the technological knowledge in the use of media between Native teachers and the students. This is a project that I work with in terms of service learning, still with a community educational model with the 16th Street Community Health Center and Escuela Verde, and in partnership also with the Milwaukee Sewage District about the restoration of the Kinnickinnic River. So I work with 12 students here with a co-director, and unfortunately my co-director died recently of an accident, and my very good friend. But we completed this program that is being used right now in specific and targeted dissemination in multicultural communities in Milwaukee, in processes and in meetings and events that discuss different cultural and social issues in the area. This is also a model of cohort that was advanced, and this is something that right now we're doing with the Medill Explorers program, but we started this in 2016, well, way before, with the tribal youth media, but with my own group at the Menominee Nation. We had these cohort trips, and in this one specifically, we went to Pine Ridge Reservation, and my students participated in building solar panels, planting trees all over the reservation, and participated of many different cultural activities. They dancing in powwows, they were working and putting hands on in different activities in the full reservation. And we stayed at the Red Cloud Renewable Energy Center. And after that, we continue with a fiction program. This is the first American Indian fiction film done in the Midwest and with youth. Before were all documentaries. So now it's in use. And with that, I completed my model of activity system related to the use of participatory educational media and sustainable education. And this is a completed process that was completed in 6 years of working. About that, I wrote an article called Educational Digital Media Tools to Reformulate Activity and Object in Indigenous Science and Environmental Education in an international educational journal. And I created also a channel, right? It's an educational indigenous media channel that now has 53 documentaries and media pieces that have thousands of viewers and are being shared all over the country and in the world, serving educational purposes. After that, in this reflection, I created also, and this is way before the pandemic, in 2016 and 17, I created a Global Indigeneity and Sustainability seminar where we were already doing virtual classes with representatives from indigenous communities from all around the world. Sometimes we had 9 or 12 hours of time difference, and the presenters, who were important leaders and faculty and researchers, were presenting in the middle of the night in their own countries in Asia and Africa. It was a wonderful initiative and a wonderful course that brought me to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that I brought the Menominee Nation representatives. We also received members of the Sami Nation from Sweden and Norway at the College of Menominee Nations. So I started serving these cross-bridge person and contact person for indigenous issues at the university. And I decided it was not enough. The university had a huge issue understanding how international indigeneity could be relevant to their efforts on creating the UW Native Nations workforce or task force that talked about the indigenous peoples only in the state. But through my research, I found the interconnection between indigenous peoples across the world. So what you see here are my badges since I started attending UN conferences and traveling all across the world in very remote areas. I went to Himalayas, I went to Mozambique and India, Nepal, and many other countries, most in Africa and Asia. And the last one was at the Climate Change Conference this last November in Glasgow. You see here in the photos, super tired after so many hours. And all the research frameworks and data sources that I used for my trips were different cases studies on biodiversity conservation and use of traditional knowledge. I looked for traces of models of collective knowledge production across the world. And I looked also for traces of the problematization of the knowledge systems and how critical social research could be used to locate indigeneity as a social phenomena in their own historical context and social structures. I collected semi-structured interviews to key international researchers and policy analysts across the world, and I've been a participant observer at the many different UN conventions and meetings, and also engaged in the membership on IUCN work groups and commissions in many different topics until right up by when the pandemic started, and I made a pause. These are also my data sources of places where I've been and the peoples who I interviewed over the years. And one of the most important issues, and that's why I'm saying that the media itself and digital media and putting digital media and reaching mainstream media is not enough. What we need is just in the specific context of indigenous peoples is to center on important issues that have a critical impact in the way in which indigenous peoples live today. And one area that I found important is how intellectual properties has this a huge economic dimension, especially in the use of genetic resources. And by now, and this is a publication from 2020, we now know that approximately 80% of the world population relies on traditional medicine. 70% of those plants were originally used in traditional medicine, and approximately $5.4 billion would flow on indigenous and local communities around the world if multinational corporations paid royalties. So what we have now is a huge economic and political issue that has legal implications. In the 17 Sustainable Development Goals will have a complete different approach if only corporations would pay the royalties that they should for the use of medicinal plants with associated traditional knowledge, and pay also the indigenous communities that develop these resources. So for me, one of the most important topics the media should approach today, and especially media related to indigenous peoples, are the issues around genetic resources and around the issues of the Convention of Biological Diversity. And now we have a series of events in Geneva with the advisory boards that are meeting, and probably I will go to Geneva in 2 or 3 weeks to participate on that, because I'm a member of Indigenous International Delegation. So these are the most important topics that are being discussed right now in media, and any efforts to bring indigenous media into mainstream should talk about, and not necessarily the issues of entertainment or just cultural preservation, but mostly issues that have impact on the economic development, on political participation, on the legal recognition, etc., and of course the management of natural resources. So in terms of the management of biodiversity conservation, I've been working with Oneida, Iroquois corn growers, and from the Haudenosaunee Confederation. I work with the U.S. Indigenous Food Sovereignty Movement and doing different research and educational approaches and initiatives with the open source mechanism at with the Department of Botany, and also in my international approaches to this issue with the United Nations. I approached the World Intellectual Property Organization and research about the issues with the medicinal patent pool that now have, for example, in certain parts of the world, even in Western hospitals, and a practitioner that is specialist or expert on medicinal and traditional medicine, and a Western doctor sitting together. Thanks to the new medicines patent pool, now is possible that traditional medicine can be exercised in Western hospitals. And I've been working in India on presenting, especially during the 2019 World National Seed Fest, the relationship between the establishment of seed banks and gene banks and disaster prevention in hotspots areas like Kerala in South India, that had a huge monsoon that killed so many people and also destroyed many crops because of agricultural, intensive agriculture and monoculture, monocrops. So we have now a huge importance of how indigenous peoples and their practices in terms of traditional knowledge and the use of plant genetic resources and climate change prevention is very important for the whole world. And as we see in this map, most of the places where indigenous peoples live coincide with these extractive frontiers, right? In the graphic that you have in your right. So the indigenous contributions to the management of these specific environmentally sensitive territories is key to prevent disasters and to promote the restoration of these important ecosystems. I went to Mozambique and interviewed, for example, the World Food Award, Maria Andrade, the lady in the second picture. She had $300 million award to bring orange flesh sweet potato and incorporate the knowledge of indigenous peoples in Africa that are still now defining their indigeneity, and through a process of seed and knowledge dissemination through and beyond the borders of Mozambique, through many different countries. And this is the project that I have been researching and maintaining contact with for the opportunities to work with this program as a host in Mozambique for other applications in East, Central, and West Africa and Southeast Asia around exchanges of traditional knowledge in multiple applications. I also have been working with the United Nations Environment Program, and as you see now, I've been mentoring a group of authors of this report about stakeholder engagement on indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is a way in which environmental leaders and youth that engage not in media, but also in education and science research are reporting about their own conclusions and their own proposals in terms of international law related to environmental protections. So, and it's important that media then catches up with what is happening in terms of the emergence of indigenous people's knowledge systems that now, for example, is talking about bioindicators or biocultural indicators that have different correlations between the rights-based approach, equity, resource mobilization, how people, different generations, different genders, different governance systems, and different values are being put in practices and engage in the ways in which indigenous peoples reimagine, reinvent their own sustainability in the present conditions. So it's important that we, in our efforts to develop media, a meaningful representation, we attend the ways in which the shifts in biological research and governance of indigenous peoples is being deployed today, and how the role of research universities is contributing to this process. As I said, the major umbrella or framework that we have today for these dialogues should be the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the nexus research that results from that. And to engage in this process through our different academic programs in how to research in which ways indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems can be productively merged, used, combined, and explored at the same time of science, social sciences, and biological sciences, discuss the rights or interventions, educational interventions or science intervention in populations and territories with the most vulnerable peoples of the world, and in the respect and consideration of their restoration processes, restoration, environmental, social, cultural, and political. And this process has to be engaged in the consideration of these two paradigmatic realities in which the emic world that informs the indigenous peoples matches, or at least works proactively, with the ethic world that science and academia is engaged into. We see, therefore, a new changes in frameworks in the way in which research institutions and political institutions, etc., engage with indigenous peoples. We see the emergence of the process of consultation that is right now a law, and we need to advance in many other frontiers. So in order to finish this presentation, I have just to mention that there are critical implications in the way in which we need to understand education and media representation for indigenous peoples in the consideration of the most important topics for them. In this case, biodiversity conservation, climate change, the need to educate research universities, administrators about the importance of indigenous knowledge systems and about who the indigenous peoples are, and reshape these institutions' policies to not only welcome and assimilate indigenous students, but also include and incorporate their knowledge systems and their cultural and political identities into their instruction. And for sure, for research organizations, the departure from exploitative and oppressive practices from natural science and biomedical researchers, and to learn that it's not fair to gather data without proper consent. So this is the latest article that I wrote about the importance and why an global indigenous media network would or should be based on, and what it implies for regenerated futures around indigenous people's meaningful representation. And so I suggest different ways in which research universities should play and should assist indigenous peoples in these processes. And these are my conclusions again. The way in which we need to grow our awareness, to need to work differently with indigenous peoples, to support their capacity, reaffirming their knowledge systems, local processes, principles, and dynamics, to understand non-Western cultural and technical paradigms of many different fields like agroecology and genetic resources management practices, to affirm the importance of the necessary consensual nature of knowledge integration, and that educational interactions and integrations must be based on the mutuality of critical responsibility between the participants from Western and non-Western societies. These are my future research and interests and practices. I will continue working with the Medill School, the Buffett Institute, CNR, and with International Indigenous Media Partnerships. I am part of the United Nations Indigenous Media Caucus of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And I plan to write books and articles in indigenous education and sustainability with the consideration of these complex topics that I mentioned, and contribute to strengthening Global South networks, connect with CNR, not only through American Indian communities, but try to promote interconnection with international indigenous communities as well. And I will start developing by mid of this year, and from the next 3 years, a series of documentary series of 12 chapters of a project called The Fourth Directions. So that's what I have for today. And I want to thank you very much for your interest in my presentation about the roles of media and rights-based approaches to Indigenous people's contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Morales, for such an important and insightful presentation. We only have 3 more minutes. I want to quickly remind the audience, if they have any questions, maybe we can reach them. They have a Q&A box in the bottom of the page, but I'm gonna ask the question that I have. Throughout your presentation, I kept thinking about the role of social media. And I've been following some of the literature of social media for the past years, and I've seen almost, I would say zero, but close to zero representation of how indigenous peoples use social media, how they appropriate them, for example, how they make use of their languages in social media, which is quite an explored topic. So I want to ask you, across all your educational media projects and across your future projects, how do you see the role of social media in bringing more representation, both to the lives of indigenous peoples, and also to the research, because it's so underrepresented, right? The research of how indigenous peoples use social media. I want to ask you that. Thank you.
I think that the trick is to understand who is served by these initiatives, because what I pointed out is that we have in parallel an internal educational media and digital media component that runs across and internally many indigenous communities today, and it serves their internal communication dynamics. And in parallel, what we have is a very incipient, very, very weak yet educational media and digital media, in commercial broadcast media, etc., representation of indigenous peoples. There is a very, very small number of these initiatives, but we have to ask about what is the ultimate goal there. If, and in my opinion, indigenous communities across the world are intercommunicated by internet-based platforms, but what we need right now is a process in which non-indigenous communities, the majority of mainstream population, need to be re-educated or educated about indigenous people. So we need to actually develop a component for the outside world, right? We need to engage as you said, also in social media, etc., not thinking on connecting necessarily with other indigenous folks and peers. What we need is a process to contact the outside world, right? Mainstream audiences, and audiences around the world who have no experience, no prior knowledge about indigenous peoples, and therefore to create a movement, a process in which mainstream society catches up with what indigenous peoples represent, and from those platforms to promote and build a form of meaningful representation that would change forever the way in which they are perceived by policy, by governments, by institutions, by universities, by everyone. But we need this visibility. Without that visibility, indigenous peoples, as you point out, they don't exist, right? For millions of people across the world, they don't exist. And that is not fair.
And on that very important message and very important tone, I want to thank Reynaldo for a wonderful and very important presentation. As Mora said, I want to thank Mora for great moderation, to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us next week for the next installment of our virtual seminar series, and also to follow the recording of this talk and all the others in our YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Reynaldo. This was excellent.
Thank you so much.